Thank you very much for attending this session. Today I'm going to be talking about evolving an interdisciplinary course to enhance student learning. My name is Gareth Morris and I work at Xianjiao Tong Liverpool University. My co-presenter is Lile. She works at the Suzhou Science and Technology Town Foreign Language School. Our apologies, but her work commitments mean that it's impossible for her to present today. The plan had been that she would present the literature behind these areas we're going to consider, and then I would elaborate upon them with actual real world examples drawn from a specific course. However, clearly that's not going to take place, so if you do have any questions, you're more than welcome to ask either of us in due course. However, just for today, I'm afraid it's just going to be me. So if I go on to briefly consider what I'm going to talk through, well, I will quickly go over the biographies. I will then consider joint delivery before focusing in on a specific module titled Imagining the City. I will look at its formative years and then how it evolved its syllabus, delivery pattern, content, learning spaces, staffing, and ICT in order to be its best possible version, all things considered. Now, I've already said a little bit about where both of us work. I'm not going to go into the specifics because I think if you're interested, then you can obviously read this in greater detail in due course. What I will spend a bit more time going through is the origins of joint delivery. Now, joint delivery could also be termed CLIL in many ways, and it actually got rebranded as CLIL a few years after it had initially been coined as joint delivery, in that you had a module being jointly delivered by numerous partners. Now, this might be collaborative departments, centres, schools, but basically you had a number of stakeholders contributing to a specific offering. This arose at Xianjiao Tong Liverpool University because of concerns over students struggling with language and academic content. It was also meant to ease transition from year 1 to years 2 to 4, and based on a recommendation from a language centre's internal periodic review at that point. The first joint delivery module was the one we're going to consider today, and initially it drew on 3 collaborative areas: urban planning, English culture and communication, and the language centre. What is interesting as well is that on an institutional level, within 3 years or so, the number of joint delivery modules had increased from 1 to 23. The number of contributing departments or centres had risen to 11. Within another couple of years, it was up in excess of 35 in terms of simply the number of modules. There were different ways in which joint delivery was provided. It might be in the form of a language centre owned module, where the departments contributed core content, but the language centre had seminars and had control over the assessments and basically oversight of the syllabus holistically. An alternative to that would be the departments or the schools owning the module and the language centre providing seminar support, but not having ownership of the assessments and oversight of everything else. The final way in which joint delivery was occasionally administered, and this became more popular through the years, was more light touch, in that the modules were owned by the departments or schools, and the language centre provided online support. Now, obviously, in today's COVID era, this is ever more pertinent, but at the time it was quite novel and perhaps deemed to be the least desirable route in terms of what you might actually achieve in some respects of the 3 joint delivery approaches. Now, if I consider this module specifically, well, its origins go back 6-7 years now. It was the first module to make use of student-produced videos as an assessment. It held an outdoor film festival showcasing some of these films in its first year. It began as an urban planning module, but within a year was transferred over to the language centre. It did necessitate a rethinking of large classroom structures, spaces, and utilage. And in addition to that, the delivery pattern used to be a case of 1 hour pre-lecture, lecture split into 2 parts, and then 1 hour post-lecture. Now, within a year, there were changes to the module beyond just simply ownership. One of the big differences was brought about because students struggled to see how all of the different topics held together. And so methods were brought in which were designed to better integrate topics, for example, concept mapping. Language criteria were also added to the learning outcomes because they were obviously important, especially now that ownership had been transferred. And departmental staff changed. And as departmental staff changed, so did some of the provision, because as new people came on board, they had different preferences for what they would like to deliver and what they felt was appropriate. Now, in its first incarnation, you can see some of the topics which were listed. You can also get an appreciation of why they seem quite arbitrarily organised and why this might have presented problems for the students in terms of bringing it all together, because this organic approach, which hoped in some respects that students would see the connections intuitively, in reality often struggled to achieve that effect. As a result, the syllabus became more blocked. This blocking was not only brought about by a desire to link similar topics to one another, but also because the assessment sequence listed in the learning outcomes or the module specifications necessitated certain topics to precede other topics. So in order to adhere to the module specifications and better enable students to make sense of a diverse range of areas brought together under an umbrella theme, i.e. the city, this was felt to be preferential. However, as you can see on the screen, the blocking pattern did evolve a couple of times over the years. Sometimes there were slight movements in the sequencing, and this basically meant that we got to a stage where everything was as settled as it possibly could be, until, that is, staffing evolved. Now, the overarching block pattern didn't have to change too much, but the sequence within smaller blocks potentially did. Another thing which evolved a number of times over the years was a delivery pattern. So, as you've seen at the beginning, it started with a 1-2-1 approach, although that middle the 2 hours of lectures was split in half over a couple of days. Now, other approaches trialled were 1-2-1 without the middle lecture being split. So a 1 hour pre-lecture seminar went before the lecture, and then a 1 hour post-lecture seminar followed. The drawback to this was that sometimes students felt that it was too much for a 5-credit module, and they didn't always have enough time to explore certain things in the depth they would have liked in those seminars. So an alternative approach which was tried was a 2-2 pattern, because even with a 2-hour seminar preceding or following the lecture, you can still have that pre-post approach. 1 hour looks backwards, 1 hour looks forward, but it enables you to have a bit more flexibility with the timings. Again, there were pros and cons to both approaches, and I think it varied between the years because inevitably student cohorts pointed out these pros and cons. So there was no one best option, and sometimes it simply came down to timetabling necessities, which were dependent on other timetabling considerations. As far as the content went, well, one of the big developments on this module was linked to institutional developments. So when the module first ran, it was owned by Urban Planning, and it had contributions from English, Culture and Communication, with a Language Centre support as well. Now, I've mentioned how the Language Centre took ownership after the first year, and you still had input from Urban Planning, who preferred to have a single lecturer covering all of their content, but you also had English, Culture and Communication still providing material, and they tended to split it up, so one person would take 1 week, another person would take another week. Now, as the years went by, English, Culture and Communication split as a film school was created. So some of the staff who used to contribute continued to contribute, albeit from their new school structure. A couple of years later, the film school had an offshoot again, so there was a Department of Media and Communication. So by the final year this module was run, there was the film school contributing, the Departments of Media and Communication, English, and Urban Planning, as well as the Language Centre. So you had 5 contributors from across the university, which made it very interesting, but also potentially quite problematic to coordinate. Now, the assessments also evolved. So, a couple of the big developments and changes were, as alluded to already, the descriptors. So, I've mentioned how a language element was brought into the descriptors, and I've also mentioned how this module assessed student videos. Well, it also had an individual essay and weekly quizzes. With the weekly quizzes, we trialled a number of approaches to this. So we varied the number of quizzes throughout the semester. Some years we had as few as 2 with higher credit weightings, hoping that the higher credit weightings would incentivize greater engagement with the quizzes. Some years we had as many as 6 quizzes. Now it didn't jump from 2 to 6. It tended to evolve upwards and then downwards. So the thinking behind having more quizzes was that they'd be more frequent, we could better assess ongoing learning, and that we could address deficiencies as and when they arose. Of course, the flip side to that was that the students felt that the quizzes were not that important because they were so small in terms of credit weighting, and so they didn't always engage with them as properly as they should, and they didn't always prepare for them as well as they should. Now, this was despite the students being able to use their lecture notes in the quizzes. The rationale behind this was that it would incentivize note taking, which is quite an important skill, and also ensure that they were paying attention in the lectures rather than getting potentially distracted by technology and all of the side features that technology can provide to this generation of learners. With the actual essay and the video assessment, what we also tried to do not only was bring in a language component, but we tried to make sure that the assessment descriptors very clearly were evaluating the learning outcomes. Because sometimes you can have marking descriptors which don't clearly evaluate the learning outcomes, or they do so only tenuously. So we tried to make sure that we were really very clearly evaluating the learning outcomes and that students can make that connection and see it very, very obviously. As far as learning and teaching spaces go, well, I think it's fairly apparent how important the learning space is, because it has a huge impact on what actually takes place within any given environment. We're all familiar with tiered learning spaces, the more traditional lecture approach and the more traditional lecture setup. What perhaps we're less familiar with using and utilising are the bigger, flatter spaces. Now, these bigger, flatter spaces can be incredibly productive. For example, what you can see now in the picture is one that we were using for the majority of this course. You had 3 screens, you had whiteboards, you had boards at the back where you could pin things up, and the students could really get into it. So they could work in groups, they could design posters and presentations and material, they could put it up on the board. You could also have the screens running at the same time. It was a very interesting space, and it also necessitated at times team teaching. That's something a lot of us are also unfamiliar with and unaccustomed to. So, I mean, most of us go into a classroom and it's simply you have sole ownership. Because you can have so many students in a single space, because it can be quite difficult to manage potentially, because so much can happen in it, one of the approaches adopted was to bring in a team teaching approach whereby you had 2 practitioners in the room for the seminars. Now, this of course meant that you had to work together to prepare. You also had to work together during delivery. And if you got it right, it could be incredibly beneficial and incredibly stimulating for everybody. If you got it wrong, well, I mean, it could be a disaster. So again, these are some examples of what we had to work with and experiment with and trial in many ways on this module. ICT was something else which basically evolved over time. So of course, one of the traditional things with ICT is the PowerPoint. The traditional lecturing approach or way to communicate using a whiteboard. We also had video presentations, as I've alluded to. We had group-based discussions which could take place either online with apps or, again, on the tables. And in an era of blended learning, that's quite nice to be able to have the dual approach. We could also do things whereas traditionally, take hand drawing, for example. You imagine someone sitting down and drawing a picture, and you can only have so many people crowded around watching it. With technology, you can actually watch someone, the lecturer, for example, draw on a OHP or the electronic equivalent, and this gets projected up onto the screen. And the students can see it evolve as it progresses, and that can be quite interesting. So again, there are lots of ways in which technology could and was beneficial. And I think an obvious one which came in the latter couple of years pre-COVID was making things like formative quizzes more engaging. So you might have your traditional, more static, Moodle-based quiz. Alternatively, something like Kahoot, as long as it's not overused, can be very engaging because it has the music and the game-based aspect or side to it. So there are a lot of ICT features which we incorporated and tried to incorporate to enhance what we were delivering. Now, again, I've touched upon the space we utilised and used. I've mentioned we had poster displays. I've talked about concept maps and group-based work such as role plays, debates, small group discussions, and I've touched upon also virtual chats via things like Padlet or technology-based apps. If I now consider what this course ultimately kind of realised, well, I think the target was to promote and foster in the student interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary learning, and this course certainly did that. It drew on a lot of information from a lot of different areas, and by the end, quite systematically and coherently presented it. It enabled creative thinking through a number of different ways and means. It promoted effective communication strategies, and there were lots of ways that students had to communicate both formatively and summatively. It meant that collaboration was essential. Now, going forward, of course, this module has run its course. It won't be offered again, and that's more because of institutional developments than anything else. It is being considered as a MOOC. It is being considered as an example of a course which can be shortened and then rolled out online for a wider audience. It has already facilitated joint research projects, and we've had co-publications and co-presentations with staff from across the university. And by the same measure, it's enhanced teaching and learning cooperation. So all things considered, it was a very successful module. It is a module that improved year on year. And even when in its final run, it was hit by the COVID, everything being moved online, status quo, it still performed very, very well. So it's a module that I look back on very favourably and with many fond memories, and I'm proud to have been a part of it because I've worked with some very, very good people on it. So in summary, I've talked about joint delivery. I've introduced a module called Imagining the City. I've gone through some features of the syllabus, the delivery pattern, the content, the learning space, staffing, and ICT. There's a very short reference list provided. And if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to ask me. Again, thank you, very much for attending. I hope you have a fantastic conference, and take care and all the very best.